Demand forecasting in a supply chain. The learning objectives are to discuss the significance of demand and supply planning in a supply chain, to understand the decisions to be taken during the demand planning process. Third, to discuss the tools which are used in demand planning. The learning outcomes: to understand the importance of demand and supply planning in a supply chain, to understand the decisions to be taken during demand planning process. Third, the knowledge on the tools used in demand planning. Let us have an introduction to supply chain. The supply chain involves in moving around materials from the supplier point to the customer point through the intermediaries in a cost-effective manner to satisfy the customer. In this process, we can visualize information flow, fund flow, material flow across the supply chain in both directions. The primary objective of the supply chain is to satisfy the customer needs and generate profit. Supply chain management is the set of activities involved in efficiently integrating the suppliers, manufacturers, warehouses, and stores so that the products which are produced are distributed at the right quantities to the right locations at the right time in order to minimize the system-wide costs while satisfying the service level requirements of each member in the supply chain to meet the customer expectations. Having known what supply chain is about, let us look into the role of forecasting in supply chain. A good and accurate forecast will determine how much inventory a company can keep at various supply and demand points along its supply chain. It helps in making decisions on the quantity and time of continuous replenishment. Sharing of updated information continuously across the supply chain improves the demand planning process of the supply chain. A good forecast reduces the level of inventory maintained with the manufacturer and typically follows vendor management inventory system and reduces the cost of the supply chain. This helps the company to follow just-in-time inventory. An accurate forecast helps in planning the lead time appropriately and delivers the product on time to the customer. Now let us take an example of a supply chain of the retail giant Reliance Mart. When you look into the supply chain of Reliance Mart, we can understand that the demand from the customer end is captured by the retail outlet and shared with the distribution center or the central warehouse. Then the central warehouse translates this demand to the downstream members of the supply chain towards the suppliers. This helps the members of the supply chain to plan their manufacturing and supply according to the requirement of the customers at the right time. So, the decisions of the members of this supply chain are based on the demand of the customer. The demand for certain products are high, whereas the customer pulls the product from the system. When the demand for the product is low, the products are pushed from the system to the customer. Whether it is a pull product or a push product, the supply chain has to estimate the demand for the products, which is important for the supply chain manager. A supply chain manager can estimate the future forecast based on the past data. With the past data, he can predict, estimate the future demand, which is known as the forecast of demand. When the demand is stable, forecasting the demand becomes easy, whereas if the demand is not stable, then a good forecast is needed for the efficient demand planning of the supply chain. Now, having understood what is the role of forecast in supply chain, now let us look at the characteristics of a forecast. The characteristics of a forecast can be one, the demand uncertainty, which we call it as the forecast error, which is the key input to the supply chain decisions. Take the example of Reliance Mart. The store's manager forecasts the demand for a product based on the past data and with his experience in the store. But that forecast may not be accurate, as there may be many uncontrollable factors affecting the demand, leading to a forecasting error. This is an important characteristic of forecast which may affect the supply chain decisions. Second, the long-term forecast is less accurate when compared to the short-term forecast, which is more accurate. In Reliance Mart, weekly forecast of demand will be more accurate than a monthly forecast of demand, which may help in improving the efficiency of the supply chain. Third characteristic, aggregate forecast is more accurate than the disaggregate forecast for a supply chain. For example, in the supply chain of Reliance Mart, if the forecast of the retail outlet is shared with the upstream members and downstream members to make a total forecast by them, it will be more accurate than an independent forecast of each member. Fourth characteristics, longer the supply chain of a company, greater the distortion of information resulting in forecast error. Example, the Reliance Mart supply chain. If the supply chain is longer, there is always a chance of distortion of information leading to a forecast error, which may cause the bullwhip effect. This may have an impact or effect on the demand of the supply chain. Hence, the demand for a product is based on the influence of several factors like past data, lead time, promotions, economic conditions, pricing policy, competition, supply situation, and their interrelationship. Knowledge about the market and environment will help the supply chain manager in making a good forecasting decision. Forecast has two components, systematic component and a random component. A systematic component measures the expected demand and uses the trend and seasonality of the demand in forecasting, whereas a random component measures the fluctuations in demand from the expected value of demand by analyzing the uncontrollable factors and estimating the forecasting error, which is a very important input to the supply chain managers in forecasting demand. In this episode, we have discussed the role of forecasting in supply chain and understood the characteristic of forecasting. In the next episode, we will discuss the different forecasting methods. Thank you.